It's now been almost 1,000 days since Russia launched its full-scale invasion, and Ukraine bracing for what could be the most difficult winter of the war so far. For more, let's speak to our correspondent in Kyiv, Gulliver Cragg. Hello to you, Gulliver. Zelensky saying that Ukraine must do all it can to end the war next year through diplomacy, but Ukrainian leadership clearly not happy with this Schultz-Putin phone call. Why not?
Well, as Zelensky said, I think he doesn't like the idea of numerous leaders talking to Vladimir Putin almost as though Ukraine and Russia were on the same level, rather than Russia being ostracized as the aggressor country that started an unprovoked war against Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't like the Kremlin being given a platform, as inevitably happens if these conversations take place, for media to start reporting the Kremlin readouts. And we're hearing again these allegations of NATO having an aggressive policy towards Russia and different pretexts for the war that Putin set out just before the full-scale invasion happened, which have pretty well been debunked. I think there's a broad consensus that this war is because Vladimir Putin simply cannot stand Ukraine being an independent, Western-leaning country and wants to take Ukraine back over, install at the very least a puppet government here. The Ukrainians don't want the world to lose sight of that, and I think they feel that they need to speak up publicly and say that they don't like these calls happening. On the other hand, in Ukrainian media now, there's a lot of discussion about this call and what it might mean, and in a way, I think that for some people it's useful, and perhaps this is what Olaf Scholz himself thought partially, to check whether Vladimir Putin's stance has moved even a tiny bit. So I'm hearing this morning on the radio analysis as to whether the fact that the Kremlin readout said that any peace settlement must take into account territorial realities has any meaning. Because previously that was not exactly what Vladimir Putin was saying. He was saying that he would not even sit down to talk unless Ukraine gave up huge swathes, more of its territory, including the 700,000 population city of Zaporizhia. Is there anything to be read into that, or do we think that Vladimir Putin's position still is actually going to be that he wants Ukraine to give up yet more territory? Of course, Ukraine's position is that it won't give up any territory at all and wants Russia to pull out of the areas that it currently occupies, which is what Olaf Scholz said. But at the same time, Olaf Scholz is refusing to give Ukraine permission to fire long-range missiles into Russia, which Ukraine says is essential to turn the tide in this war.
Yeah, and amid all the speculation about potentially freezing the conflict along the current front lines, it's not clear, is it, where those front lines will be when Trump takes office in more than 2 months' time?
Exactly, because the Russians are continuing to advance in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk region, and the Ukrainians are very much on the back foot. Clearly, they lack personnel. We're hearing that some brigades are only staffed up to 50% of the level that they should be. I mean, at the moment, the Russian advance is not what you'd call galloping forward. They do take more bits of territory every day, particularly in Donetsk region. Sometimes, as this morning, we hear of Ukrainian counterattacks that the Ukrainians claw back a little bit of territory. There's also Kursk region in Russia, where the Ukrainians have occupied part of that territory, and the Russians are counterattacking, having amassed a massive force there for that purpose. The news this morning is that the Ukrainians counterattacked and took a bit more territory in Kursk region. But I think that these pieces of news are the exception rather than the rule. At the moment, the Russians have really got huge numerical superiority. And although they are taking huge losses, the Ukrainians say, 1,500 casualties per day. That means either dead or wounded so badly that they can't return to fight. That's probably an exaggeration, but I've heard British intelligence reports coming up with similar figures. So the Ukrainians have got this hope that the Russians will at some point be exhausted, but at the same time, they're taking losses too. And there's clearly a very, very serious risk of the Russians starting to advance more rapidly.
All right, Gulliver, thank you very much. Gulliver Cragg reporting from Kyiv.